And welcome everybody to this inaugural event of the Australian Jewish Association. Welcome to our Jewish community, and a special welcome also to our Christian supporters whose friendship we value very highly. My name is Alan Friedman, and sitting in the front is Dr. David Adler, who's the convener of the Australian Jewish Association, and the Reverend Dr. Mark Jury, who many of you will know is an Anglican minister from the church in Glen Eira Road, opposite the 7-Eleven, and who is also a scholar of Islam. Well, despite two concerted efforts by the militant Jewish left in this town, and despite some of our communal leaders trying to shut us down, we fought off the thought police, and it's great to see so many people here, so thank you all for coming. And I also want to thank the South Caulfield Hebrew congregation for hosting us at short notice. Their president-elect is there, that's David, so I mean, they've been fantastic. The trolls on Facebook even got wind of this event and tried to pressure the synagogue to cancel, but to their credit, they stood firm, and we appreciate it. It seems that any discussion on Islam is one that you're just not allowed to have in this town. And I have to say that I'm angry at two groups for making tonight a lot more difficult to have. The militant left cannot make one logical, coherent, intelligent argument about anything. All they can do is abuse people with vulgar language and hurl personal insults. That's their standard arrangement. And I'm also angry with some of our communal leaders who claim to support an open and inclusive Jewish community, but in fact feel very threatened by anyone who doesn't share their own particular worldview. And it seems that the only freedom of expression you're allowed to have is the freedom to agree with them. In the Jewish news this week, we had the President of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry saying, and I'll quote, "It is objectionable if a new organisation purports to speak for or represent the Australian Jewish community as a whole." Let me say that starting the Australian Jewish Association was never about trying to take over. All we have ever wanted to do was provide an opportunity for those Jews with politically conservative views to be included in part of the conversation. And the issue is not only about using venues owned by the Jewish community, because as you know, the Beth Wiseman is owned by the Jewish community, and the event was cancelled a couple of weeks ago. You may be interested to learn that the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, which is their equivalent to our JCCV, the Jewish Community Council of Victoria, tried to stop this talk being delivered in Sydney last Sunday night. So that just destroys their argument. However, some community leaders, or one community leader, was prepared to stand up for our right to bring you this talk, and that was Daddy Lamb, President of the Zionist Federation of Australia and President of Mizrachi. He's in Canberra and not able to be here tonight, but I want to acknowledge him as the one person of integrity and principle in a sea of left-leaning control freaks determined to silence any alternative views to their own. Now, you're in for a great treat tonight with the speakers we have, and we're planning plenty of time for discussion so that you can have your say. I'm not going to make any more long speeches at this point because we have a full program and we want to get started. But I just want to give you a very brief overview of why the AJA, the Australian Jewish Association, was formed in the first place and what it's about. The AJA is a new voice for the Jewish community in Australia. It is unique in being formed on conservative principles and guided by genuine Torah Jewish religious values, both in policy and in its advocacy role. The website says that you can expect it to be more direct and outspoken on matters of principle rather than cowed by political correctness. And isn't that going to be a refreshing change? AJA will speak out clearly on security issues, sources of anti-Semitism and other external threats and advocacy involving Israel. I imagine a lot of you will be familiar with the abusive treatment that has been dished out to the people involved in the formation of this organisation, and I think this really highlights why it was necessary to form the organisation in the first place. And on that, I'm going to give you the little commercial. We do need you to join. There are forms around. There's a table there. There's a table over there with application forms. You may want to pay tonight. You're welcome to take to fill out the form and take it home. And you can do it online. But the only way we're really going to prove that we are or we have been the silent minority is by having big numbers. So we ask you to do that. Okay, so this is the agenda for tonight. In a moment, we're going to have the presentation by David Adler that everybody has assumed is a bigoted, racist rant. Mind you, not one of those people even bothered to inquire exactly what it was about, but that didn't matter to them. The presentation does go for almost an hour, but it contains several video clips, so it won't be David talking non-stop for an hour. After that, we will have a short coffee break, just to stretch our legs, and then we're hearing from Mark Jury, and then having an open discussion. And if we have a chance, we also want to play some of Izzy Liebler's comments that we aired on Nothing Left last Tuesday, as he has something to say about the way the Jewish community is running in this country, or the way it should be run. Just one more thing to mention, on the tables also, there is a petition coordinated by the Christian community under the auspices of Bridges for Peace. That's an organisation based in Queensland. It's run by Keith Buxton, who is absolutely fantastic, and it's a request, listen to this, it's a request for the Australian government to move its embassy to Jerusalem. Please take a moment to sign this if you feel inclined. Okay, Dr. David Adler is a medical graduate of the University of New South Wales, where he also received the Medical Faculty Prize for General Proficiency and Leadership. He is formerly the Deputy Medical Secretary of the Australian Medical Association, a role which provided his training ground in policy and advocacy, and he's been responsible for significant features of Australian health policy at both state and federal levels. David is an active member of Sydney's Orthodox Jewish community and participates in Torah-related learning regularly. He has served in various Jewish community representative roles. Over the last 5 years, he's studied the effects of Islam in Western countries and its impact on Jewish communities. He sees Islam as a threat, that's the word we're not supposed to use, a threat to liberal democratic values in general and to Jews in particular. David comments and writes frequently on political issues, is a popular speaker at many Jewish community events, and is known to be outspoken on issues affecting the Jewish community and as an advocate for Israel. The topic for tonight is Islam and Jews, Lessons for Australia. Please welcome David Adler to deliver his presentation.
How does anyone live up to that build-up? I've got no idea. It was interesting to see the reaction when Alan mentioned there's a Christian group that is advocating the relocation of Australia's embassy to Jerusalem. Does anyone know of a Jewish group in this country that would advocate that move?
AJA.
Now there is one. Now I'm going to actually start a little bit off topic for a few minutes, because we are not a one-subject organisation. And seeing the subject of Israel advocacy has been introduced, I want to share with you a couple of thoughts. Jewish identity in the land of Israel has been under attack by the international community, as we all know. December last year, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2334, which essentially said that Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, is not really Jewish heritage, and even the Kotel might not be Jewish. Okay. This year, UNESCO passed a resolution saying Marat HaMachpelah, the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, is Palestinian heritage. Now, we all know that's outrageous. But let me tell you, it is in part our fault. How is it our fault? In 1967, there was a miraculous victory for Israel, and the biblical heartland was captured. the strong line, Har Habayit biyadenu, the Temple Mount is out in our hands, was a slogan that really symbolised that victory. It was in our hands for 1 hour, and then the keys were handed back to the Muslim rock. When it comes to Hebron and Marat HaMachpelah, there is no organisation, Jewish organisation in this country that will say that Hebron should be part of the state of Israel, because if you are wedded to a two-state solution, implicit in that is that Jerusalem will be cut in half and half of it given for a new Palestinian Arab state, presumably, and of course most of Judea and Samaria. So here's the thought: how can we expect the international community to be more concerned about Jewish identity in Israel than we are? If we're not prepared to articulate it, we leave a vacuum, and of course a vacuum doesn't stay long, and we get these sort of resolutions. Now, I don't for a moment suggest that we're going to be able to change this completely, but what I can guarantee is that one of the principles upon which AJA was founded is to defend and promote Jewish identity in the land of Israel. That includes Yerushalayim, that includes Hebron, that includes Judea and Samaria. So now we'll move on to the actual subject. We wouldn't be here tonight without an incredible team. Alan Friedman, Michael Bird, Jeff Block, Anna Zeltzer are part of the team of AJA in Melbourne. We also have a superb team in Sydney, and you can read about them on the website. The reason we've been formed is because our existing communal organisations, as Alan has suggested, have moved more and more to the left and have largely abandoned the politically conservative space and moved away from Jewish values, and I can't tell you the number of Orthodox rabbis that we've had encouraging this move. There have been attempts to close us down, only in Melbourne. I don't know what it is about Melbourne, but this presentation was done recently in this year, New South Wales Parliament House for a major Christian body. It's been done in Auckland as part of Linwood, New Zealand. You can still see the program online. It was done in Sydney last week, no problems, no incidents. And Melbourne goes feral. I don't know. Now, I'm aware of what Mark Dury is going to talk about. I'm going to talk about mainly the what, show you what is happening. Some of you would have seen this material before, parts of it, probably not all of it, and a little bit about the why. Mark is going to focus mainly on the why and a little bit about the what. So, you know, we've had a controversial title which has had to be watered down for just to be able to proceed. Let me tell you what we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about terrorism tonight and all the problems that have been associated with aspects of Islam. We're not talking about all Muslims. I need to make this perfectly clear. And particularly in Australia, we're not talking about the majority. We are talking about a minority. But there is a minority that presents a significant problem, and we need to start a discussion. It'll become very obvious that I'm a critic of Islam because I have seen and reviewed something of the order of 50 or 60 studies that have been done to assess attitudes. There was almost a sub-industry created after 9/11 by universities, research centres, departments of social and political science, etc. So we have a lot of data. Only one study I'm aware of in Australia which assessed the question of empathy towards terrorism. Not whether you put on a suicide vest and blow yourself up in a cafe or a bus, but whether these sort of actions might be justified in certain circumstances, and the result in Australia was 21%. In Europe, the percentages tend to be in the 30s. I'm not going to show any blood and guts and gore either. Okay, let's see if this works. I'll put it closer. We get feedback if the microphone. Thank you. This is just to show you that there was a flyer about the presentation in the New South Wales Parliament House. When you're talking to Christian groups, never a problem. They're prepared to talk about it. Wasn't a problem for the management of New South Wales Parliament. And although the location within New South Wales Parliament changed because we had a bigger crowd than expected, we moved from a room to the parliamentary theatre. Islamophobia. This is a cover of the Spectator magazine from earlier this year. Now, frankly, Islamophobia is a BS term. If you can't go into an elevator because you are scared of confined spaces, you might have claustrophobia, an irrational fear of confined spaces. If I told you there was a spider over here and somebody jumps up screaming and runs out of the room, they might have arachnophobia. If it's severe enough, they won't even use the word spider because it triggers an irrational fear. Being a critic, given some of the problematic aspects of Islam, is not a phobia, it is rational. I'll just show you, I don't know if you can see down the bottom of that picture there. Jews in 18C by me. I'm one of the contributing authors to the Spectator magazine, but I have no financial interest in it. There are a number of tomes that have been written on the subject of the relationship between Islam and Jews. I think Mark Dury has content in some of his books. This is one that I've drawn on. I'm not going to talk about the theology a lot tonight, just a little bit, but I do commend that as a reference. Now, the question of whether there's a threat, I'm not going to pursue, but we'll leave you to make the judgment at the end of this presentation. Now, I want you to switch documents for a moment, because one of the things that Alan discussed was, where are our communal bodies? Now, forgive me for being New South Wales centric, but I did a study on statements made by the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. For a whole year, I took screenshots of their Facebook page. I had no idea anybody was monitoring this. So start scrolling down a little bit. Okay, here we have a case of an Israeli journalist, up a little bit so we can see the topic, there we go, an Israeli journalist being harassed on the streets of Paris. These are my comments. Harassed by whom? Souvenir sellers. She was actually being harassed by local Arab Muslims because she had Hebrew writing on her microphone, but of course no mention of the I word or the N word in the commentary on the Facebook. Next one. This is extraordinary. Heartfelt condolences to the people of Kenya and Christians everywhere about the horrific massacre of 148 people. What actually happened there was this was an Al-Shabaab terrorist attack. They're Islamic mujahideen. They separated the Muslims and the non-Muslims, and they slaughtered the non-Muslims because they hated them. But if you look at what the Jewish Board of Deputies, again, it's completely neutral. Next example. European leaders must respond forcibly to the rise of anti-Semitism in their countries. Nothing about cause again. What on earth could be causing it? Next one. Condolences from the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies to our Coptic friends on the brutal murder of 21 Coptic Christians. This was not a murder. This was where 21 Christians were lined up on the shore. They had their heads cut off. The blood went into the water because that was where Osama bin Laden had been dumped, and this was a sort of a revenge. But No mention of the cause, just murders. Next one. Denmark shooting. This one's extraordinary. The terrorist attacks in Denmark highlight once again the threat to Jewish communities worldwide. We condemn the latest incidents and we condemn the ideologies which motivate the perpetrators. I mean, some anonymous ideology. No, this was Islamic Jihad. They won't even mention it. Next one. And no other reporters, did that sort of circumlocution and wouldn't mention it. Let's go. French Jewish children were slaughtered at a school. Men in skull caps harassed. Widespread anti-Semitism. No cause. Next one. Murder of 4 Jews in the Paris kosher deli. Latest in a string of attacks from French Jews. Just, random attack. I mean, you might as well have had Barack Obama write this for the Jewish communities. Again, no. Can't mention the I word, can't mention the N word. Next one. Assault on Paris Jewish deli was by the same thugs. I mean, thugs? I mean, what on earth is meant by thugs? And look, I had pages of this, pages of it, of examples without the major communal body in New South Wales being willing to say anything about causation when it comes to Islam. Now, frankly, we've had enough of the Jewish community getting the proverbial mushroom treatment, and we will call it out. Back to the slides, please. So we're going to jump straight into the deep end. Jump straight into the deep end. This chant, Kaiba Kaiba Ya Yahud Jaish Muhammad Sayyid, is a classic chant that you'll hear during certain Islamic protests. Translated, it roughly means, Kaiba Kaiba, O Jew, Muhammad's army will return. It commemorates the 7th century battle in Saudi, where Jewish community in Kaiba was defeated. They surrendered. The men were separated from the women and children. Somewhere estimated between 600 and 900 Jewish men had their heads cut off, many personally by Muhammad. This is a call to genocide of Jews, and it's not a historical quirk. It's happening on the streets, and this chant has been made on the streets of Australia on at least 2 occasions. Okay. Maybe we need to talk about this. Now, I am going to use the word threat. How do we know there is a threat coming from this group? Because they keep telling us. They keep saying it. Not my words, you'll hear other examples. Next one is Aldous. From the same demonstration in the UK, democracy and freedom on death row, Islam is what? Islam's coming, okay. And the big banner says the followers of Muhammad will conquer America. Okay? Who is saying that Islam is incompatible with democracy? A proportion of the Muslims, not a majority, but a proportion. When I was a kid and learnt a little about history, I didn't think that I would have to stand up in front of a Jewish community and show a slide again of chants of kill the Jews and Adolf Hitler on the streets of Germany. But it happens. Go. Death to Jews. Adolf Hitler. We have hundreds of examples of various types, so not just in Europe. This is one from Canada. O Allah, destroy the accursed Jews. O Allah, kill them one by one. Wake up from the illusion that the Western governments represent Muslims, to disavow democracy, to follow the true teachings of Islam, and to work for establishing the Islamic State, the Caliphate. And this is the prayer. O Allah, destroy the accursed Jews. O Allah, show us the black day you inflict on them. O Allah, make their children orphans and their women widows. O Allah, don't leave any one of them alive. And maybe that's not a threat, I don't know. When you go into Muslim majority areas, it gets worse. This is a senior Islamic cleric, was asked about problems in Iraq. Here's part of his answer. The responsibility lies with the driving force of the Jews. Angle's a bit steep. The Iraqi army will annihilate the Jews, not leaving a single Jew in the world, and it will restore Jerusalem to the Muslims for the fourth and last time. I happen to think the top left one is particularly sick. When we make our children loathe the Jews, it is a form of worship to Allah. Hitler was right to say what he said and do what he did to the Jews. The Jew is Satan in human form. Allah described the Jews as the worst of beasts in the sight of Allah. Now, I'm not saying this is the majority of Islamic clerics. It is a minority, but it is a significant minority and have significant influence. So I'm not going to drill down on the theology, but I was interested to look at whether that last one is actually correct. And I think it comes from this particular surah in the Quran, 98.6. Indeed, they who disbelieve amongst the people of Scripture, or people of book, which is us, and sometimes referred to as the Christians and the polytheists. Sometimes in Islam, some commentators regard Christianity as polytheists because of the Trinity, will be in the fire of hell, abiding there eternally. Those are the worst of the creatures. So he's just quoting the Quran. Australian example. This is the infamous example of Ismail Al-Wawa from his book Tahrir. I was one of the first to get this video, and I passed it to our national bodies, AJAC and ECAJ, in 2015. And at the time we were having a bit of a debate about free speech. And so I thought, okay, I'm actually an advocate of free speech. I don't like ANC. But here's an example. Go for it. And of course, our communal bodies have never lodged a complaint under 18C about Islamic hate preaching. Play video.
الله سبحانه وتعالى وقاتلوهم حتى لا تكون فتنة ويكون الدين كله لله والفتنة أشد من القتل عدم قتال يهود وعدم جهاد يهود هو فتنة كل خلق الله لتجدن أشد الناس عداوة الذين آمنوا اليهود والذين أشركوا فعدم قتالهم هو شر مستطير أنواع الفساد مربوطة ببني إسرائيل وعلو بني إسرائيل الفساد الأخلاقي مربوط ببني يهود فأول بغاء في الدنيا من بني إسرائيل وأول ربا عند بني إسرائيل وأول قمار عند بني إسرائيل وأول قتل عند بني إسرائيل وقتلهم النبيين بغير الحق النبيين لا يقتلون بنو إسرائيل قتلوهم اليهود لو أعطوا الدنيا بأسرها سيتطلعوا إلى السماء هذا طبعهم هؤلاء هم فإذا هؤلاء اليهود هذا طبعهم فالوهم هو أن يظن ظان أنه مع بني إسرائيل مع يهود يمكن أن يصنع سلام ويصنع تعايش ويصنع عيش مشترك أفسدوا الدنيا بما يسمى بالفن والسينما والأفلام الفاسدة بنو إسرائيل أفسدوا الدنيا بتجارة الجنس أفسدوا الدنيا بتجارة المخدرات أفسدوا الدنيا بانحطاط الأخلاق أفسدوا الدنيا في كل شيء هؤلاء بنو إسرائيل وبين اليهود بحر من الدم.
No penalties, no complaints from our community. Well, sorry, there was. They tried it in the New South Wales legislation, which wasn't effective. But in terms of the big picture of, anyone offended or insulted by this, because they're two of the thresholds for 18C, and they wouldn't use them. I don't know why.
Neither is the DPP.
Wouldn't use it. A little girl in Melbourne holding up this sign, Jews haven't learnt they need swastika more than before. I mean, what are they teaching their children? Now, I want to make the point of a battle that we've been fighting in order to get here today, because there has been in play the most spectacular example of moral inversion that I've ever come across. This is what incites hatred and violence. We are exposing it, not doing the inciting. We think that the first step in order to deal with the problem is to expose it. I will never advocate violence, our organisation will never advocate violence or hatred or etc., but we think it's important to expose. Now, for some reason, people in our community, including senior communal leaders, couldn't understand the difference. So this relationship between Islam and Nazism deserves a little bit more explanation and exploration. There's almost a best friends forever relationship that was established in the Second World War. The pictures there, you can see the classic picture of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, with Hitler. Notes after that meeting recorded Hitler as saying the Arabs were Germany's natural friends because they had the same enemies as had Germany, namely the Jews. Incidentally, in order to glorify some of the collaborators, the Palestinian Authority in the last few years has named squares and schools after the Nazi collaborators. The bottom left one is the 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS, and you often see Nazi themes in Islamic protests. So I thought I'd do a little bit of a collation of some of the features, and that's my table. The idea of a supremacist ideology in Nazism was called the master race. It was actually Bibi Netanyahu who coined the phrase the master faith. There's some aspects that he's dealing with. Anti-Semitism present in both. Final solution documented, and I'll show you a couple of examples of that in Islam. Attitude to homosexuals, world domination, 1,000-year rifle, the caliphate. Obviously violence and cruelty exists and is motivated by some of the precepts of both ideologies. Big difference. Nazism doesn't have religious garb. Islam does, and if you wanted to find what was the genius of Muhammad, there it is at the bottom. So here's one of the final solutions in Islam, and it's the famous hadith that was taken up into the Hamas Charter about Jews hiding behind rocks and trees, and they'll call out a Muslim, a servant of Allah, come and kill the Jew. And that's required for their equivalent of Mashiach. And we're supposed to do more mitzvahs, and that's one of the steps. But does it apply today? Or is it just some quirky, historical aspect? Well, it is preached today, and here's the reaction in Copenhagen. Okay.
Vi er i en baggård på Nørrebro. Her går snakken om det, der skete inde bag murene i Al-Faruq-moskeen. Er det okay at sige sådan noget? De omstridte ord faldt i forbindelse med fredagsbønnen 31. marts i år. Prædikanten taler om konflikten i Israel-Palæstina og citerer så et islamisk skrift.
فيقتلهم المسلمون فيختبئ اليهودي وراء الحجر والشجر فيقول الحجر والشجر يا مسلم يا عبد الله هذا يهودي ورائي فتعال
I'll summarise that.
يتحقق في تلك الدولة الدولة الراشدة.
I de 2 timer, vi var ved moskeen i dag, fandt vi ikke nogen, der tog
In 2 hours we were unable to find anyone who disagrees. So basically that preacher was talking about the hadith of killing Jews. People were interviewed outside the mosque, is this correct? And they couldn't find anyone to disagree with that. Play the next one.
النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بشرنا بقتلنا
Is that legible?
قتلنا لليهود ولا يأتي الإنسان ويقول قتلنا للصهاينة ويخطئ من يقول أن هناك أن حربنا مع الصهاينة والصهاينة. هذا رد يعني على الله سبحانه وتعالى وعلى رسوله. إن حربنا مع اليهود وليست مع الصهاينة، وإن كانت الصهاينة هم من أخطر أنواع اليهود، لكن الحرب هي مع اليهود. وما ذكره الله عز وجل في القرآن وما ذكره النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في السنة الصحيحة لم يقل الصهاينة عليه الصلاة والسلام، إنما قال اليهود، وإن كان من أشدهم الصهاينة. فأقول إن حربنا في آخر الزمان قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا تقوم الساعة حتى يقاتل المسلمون اليهود فيقتلهم المسلمون حتى يختبئ اليهودي من وراء الحجر والشجر فيقول الحجر أو الشجر يا مسلم يا عبد الله. ركز معي، يا مسلم يا عبد الله، يا مسلم يا عبد الله. هذا يهودي خلفي فتعال فاقتله. قال عليه الصلاة والسلام إلا الغرقد فإنه من شجر اليهود.
Thank you very much. The angle here does make it difficult, so that was wonderful. We might hire you for a couple of months. But so we have examples in Europe and in Middle East where this principle is being preached now and is being agreed to. Okay, another example.
Palestinian woman echoes Palestinian leaders. Promised land equals a land where Jews will be gathered to be exterminated. Dear viewers, our question today is, are you optimistic about the rise of power of America Trump? We always put our hopes in Allah. This is the promised land. The Jews think it's promised to them, but what was promised was to gather them in order to exterminate them by divine decree. The woman's message is repeating both Fatah and Hamas leaders' interpretations. These Israelis have no belief, no principles.
It just goes on with other people saying pretty much the same thing, but I think the message is there. And obvious question, who's making the threats? Now, this happened only a couple of weeks ago, that on Har HaBayit we have hate preaching. Speaking at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, August 20 this year, Palestinian cleric Sheikh Ali Abu Ahmed criticised the Arab rulers, saying that while they condemned the Barcelona terror attack, which occurred recently, the rulers of the wicked mini-states were sending weapons to fight in Iraq, Syria, Libya and Yemen instead of fighting the Jews, the most despicable of Allah's creatures. That's reference back to Surah 98.6. Abu Ahmed prayed to Allah, annihilate all the Jews and to enable us to kill them. He was answered with Amen on Har HaBayit. I actually find that disturbing. I'm not going to dwell on this because Mark Dury is going to cover this much more effectively than I can. It's just something that's in my standard presentation, giving examples in the Quran. These lists were compiled by Robert Spencer, one of the Islam academics based in the US, runs an organisation called Jihad Watch. The bottom one is the one often quoted about relating Jews as apes and pigs. So what effect is this having in reality? Well, I mean, we all know about security requirements where the Islamic population is higher, the security requirements are higher. France, obviously, is the case in point. They have special forces paramilitary outside some of their schools. Occasionally they have a tank parked within reach of the schools. Germany has had a big influx of Islamic migrants recently, thanks to Merkel. And I won't go all through this, but just to draw your attention to the final sentence, there's been a 34% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in 2015 in the city of Berlin. Now, if I wanted to give you European examples, I could fill hours. After the Charlie Hebdo attack, they moved to the kosher supermarket. There was a copycat type event in Copenhagen where a free speech event was attacked, and then a shooting at a synagogue. In Belgium, an Algerian Muslim kills 4 Jews at a museum. We had one year where the entire city of Brussels cancelled Purim festivals because of threats. The Bataclan Theatre in Paris, that was one of the biggest terrorist attacks. An aspect of that wasn't widely publicised is why that particular theatre. And it had in the past Jewish ownership, and it had held pro-Israel events. Many, many more examples. But rather than cherry pick, let's have a look at a couple of general studies. This is one that's been released very recently by the University of Oslo. They identified the cause of anti-Semitism in 7 countries listed there. In 6 of the 7, all except Russia, the perpetrators were predominantly Muslim. That's the result of the study. Why didn't it occur in Russia? Well, Jews and Muslims are geographically far apart, generally speaking, in Russia, and Russia's not constrained by Western peace. I saw a video of explosives being found in a mosque in Russia, and their particular solution was to detonate the explosives and blow up the mosque. They don't muck around. This is an important study from our perspective. Because it focuses specifically on the causes, the types of anti-Semitism, and measures it using a whole variety of parameters. It's a British study. It talks about how the Jewish population are well engaged with interfaith, which I haven't yet found an example where that reverses the trend, by the way. And on every single count, and I'll show you 2 summary tables, the anti-Semitism was measured in British Muslims compared to other British people, and on every single count there was an order of magnitude difference. So that's one of the summary tables. So they ask questions like, power. I mean, all the Jewish conspiracy stuff there you can see yourself. The green bars are the percentages of measured anti-Semitism within the British Muslims, and the grey bars are the general population. What surprises me out of that chart is how big the grey bars are. I expected the green bars to be in the 30 to 40% range because I've seen many of those studies, but there's actually a significant baseline anti-Semitism in the UK as well. Maybe Jeremy Corbyn is having an effect.
There's a 1,000-year-old history embedded into the blood label and the first expulsion of Jews.
So here's some more questions, similar structure of results in the reference down below. The effects on Jewish schools, on our Jewish schools, we're all familiar with the level of security we've had to implement. This is an interesting example from the US of a teacher. How many Jews died in the Holocaust? Not enough, ha 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 ha. But it's not isolated. I'm going to show you, I'm going to be a little bit New South Wales centric again in a moment when it comes to schools, because that's where I collect most of my data. But generally speaking, we have a record in this country of a problem of financial misappropriation in the Islamic schools. 6 of them have had government funding stopped permanently or temporarily, orders to repay money. The biggest example, $9 million at Malik Fahd, not teaching the required curriculum. I'm not familiar with this college in Melbourne, but it was interesting that the principal decided that ISIS was a conspiracy between Israel and Western countries. Nothing to do with Islam, of course, and problems with teaching World War II history about the Holocaust. So, the Trojan horse phenomenon is something we've seen across our schools. This is a term that was coined in Birmingham. It describes radicalisation in public schools, and I'd encourage you just to Google the term Trojan horse Birmingham schools, and you'll get lots of reports and information. So here's New South Wales. Islamic students threatened to behead non-Muslim staffs in the name of ISIS. This is Punchbowl Boys High School. Excluding women from certain ceremonies, students being radicalised, calling staff and police pigs. Okay. We have 19 schools in New South Wales in de-radicalisation programs. 19. And the head of the New South Wales Department of Education has had to deny suggestions that it was going to become an Islamic school. Well, I mean, it's almost a de facto Islamic school. And that was just earlier this year. Here's a new subject for the curriculum. Child bride detection, school plans to spread word on prevention. A new skill. How to recognise and intervene with child brides. Now, I'm going to show you a technique. I'll get it out of my pocket. This has saved lives. And you think it's a teaspoon. Because some of the forced marriages are girls being taken overseas and married off to older men, some of them have learned a technique, and not to be too graphic, what they do is they insert a teaspoon in themselves. They go through the airport metal detectors, it's set off, the usual screening doesn't identify the cause, they're taken aside to a private room, they call for help. This is a technique which is now known. ASIO is reporting that the radicalisation is becoming younger and younger. They're now shifting from sort of the 25 to 34 group to the 15 to 24 group. Interesting case in France because it involved taking a machete to a Jewish teacher by a 15-year-old. And comments from the president of the Marseille Israelite constituency. Jews in Marseille are afraid of being victims of terrorist attack. They feel threatened by radical Islamists. We're targeted because we are French and because we are Jewish. No one feels safe. Every single day. Leaders of the Jewish community in Europe. Sydney, again, we have our junior jihadists, and they were involved in the killing of Curtis Chang, an accountant in the police department in Parramatta, having picked up the weapon. The thing that I find really scary is down the bottom, the quote that he said, "Everyone wants to die for Allah." I'm not going to spend a lot of time on halal because it's another subject, but I put this up because it's from a French study, and after money being filtered through various organisations, bottom right is $14.6 million going to Hamas was traced, and I think that's relevant to us. That's just a simplified diagram. But we have some interesting questions in Australia, and here are a few of The financial irregularities that I alluded to in the schools, it is not clear where the money has gone. There are suspicions, but not proof. There is proof for the second one that a money transfer business in Sydney was found to be funneling money to terrorism. There is suspicion it was halal fees, and it was closed down and had its licence cancelled. Certainly there's been money traced to Indonesian terrorist groups from Australia. Again, halal suspected but not proven. And the final one is spectacular. This is a quote from the Islamic Council of Western Australia, which is the largest halal authority in Western Australia, from their 2012 annual report, that they made donations to Syria through Al-Imdad charity, which is a charity that's been linked with some inappropriate organisations. And then they add this: to ensure that no recriminations could be directed to the Islamic Council of Western Australia. So the obvious question is, if it was all above board, why would you have to filter it, and why would you have to make that statement in your annual report? Now, Austrac supervises money in Australia. Once it goes overseas into a charity, they can't trace it. So if you have a look at the government inquiries, they'll say that there are suspicions but no proof, and that's the fact. We don't have the same sort of proof that we have out of Canada. I'm going to just do this very briefly because I think it's more Mark's expertise. The proposition that Islam is a religion of peace, and the quotation that's usually given is because it says in the Quran something to the effect that he who kills it is as if he destroyed the whole world. He who saves a life, it's as if he saved the world. Now we know where that came from. That came from the Talmud. Now, I think it's great that they should plagiarise from Judaism. I just wish they'd do a lot more. But, and here's the big but, if you actually look at the words, there's a qualification that is always left out in the discussion. And that's the qualification: that we decreed upon the children of Israel that particular value. That somehow disappears, and you can just Google that particular surah. If you go one further, you get one that's not so qualified about the penalty for those who wage war against Islam and his messenger and strive upon the earth to cause corruption, is none other but all these things. Definition of corruption, I'd be very interested in what Mark has to say, but a commentary I've read is that it includes criticising Islam and perhaps attending a talk. So, now, this is not just, again, theoretical. When I was with the AMA, we had an extraordinary ethical problem that doctors in the Sudan faced when they were being forced to implement Sharia. Doctors in the Sudan being forced to implement Sharia penalties. Now, the most peculiar one I thought in this list was having a hand and foot cut off on opposite sides. I have no idea what these poor guys did, but it happens. This is a document that we should all be familiar with. It's the Temple Mount Guide prior to the State of Israel, published by the Supreme Muslim Council. It identifies the site as that of Solomon's Temple beyond dispute. That's the words. How is it that now the authorities will say the opposite? We have a huge problem with the media, absolutely huge in this issue, almost as bad as the Jewish Board of Deputies. The guy on the left, Kashmir Muslim athlete denied US visa due to current policy. So the BBC wanted to give Trump a bit of a kick. But when he got into trouble with sexual assault a few weeks later, he's no longer a Kashmir Muslim. He's now an Indian athlete because of all the PC reasons. Many examples of the media doing this. Examples of the supremacist values, one of the things in the title. Bethlehem, which has been under the Palestinian Authority for some time, according to the mayor, there's been a substantial decline in the proportion of Christians. And then there's this very interesting principle: after Saturday comes Sunday is not a commentary on the order of the days of the week. It means after they deal with the Saturday people, they deal with the Sunday people. So after all that, how do you end on a bit of a positive note? Well, it's hard. But there have been some interesting developments. Islam is a general political issue. There has been a worldwide awakening. More people are talking about it. Maybe even in the Jewish community of Australia, talk about it. Undoubtedly a factor in the Brexit vote, undoubtedly a factor in the US elections. There is swinging public opinion across Europe. China and Russia that don't have our constraints are clamping down much harder. It's not an endorsement, but it's undoubtedly a factor in the swing of votes towards One Nation and Australian Conservatives. There are some MPs and journalists, commentators speaking out, and rarely you get some brave people within Islam who are advocating reform. We know a few, and I'm going to show you my favourite one in a moment, very controversial. Imam Tawhidi, who I happen to know quite well, and he's in a lot of trouble for calling out certain problems. We communicate from time to time. I've censored the quote because I didn't know who else would be in the room, and the latter part of the quote, it was a personal communication, and for trusted people I'll tell you what the censored quote is, because he said he can't announce it, it will get him killed immediately. It was telling me something that he held dear, and we do have him on the record as saying that Palestine is Jewish land, and without consulting me, this appeared on his Facebook page a few days ago.
Can you read it, David? Not everyone can see it.
It's a bit embarrassing to read. Congratulations to the Australian Jewish community on the achievement. I met David Adler this year. He is a wise man. He's not a good judge of character, okay? With a vision for this country. Likewise, we hope to see members of other faiths rise to give a new voice to their communities. Outstanding achievement. All the best, my brothers and sisters. So that was his reaction.
Why is he so brilliant?
He has taken it upon himself to be a reformer, very high risk, and he believes in building bridges. Now, if you look at some of the material he said 4 or 5 years ago, I could have used it as examples earlier in the talk. So what we are trying to do here is expose, not to cause. Our undertaking is that we will start a discussion one way or the other, and I hope this is a great first step.
Well, that was a very sobering talk. I'm sure some of us have seen some of those slides and clips before, but there are things that I didn't see. Okay, we're going to take just a very short break. Tea and coffee in the little kitchen room there, if people want to help themselves, cold drinks as well. Toilets are out this door. The men's is just behind that door. Women's is a little bit down the way. So please, just quickly, 10 minutes, and then we'll continue.
They actually published the email on the.
So they just they have a class you should see what goes on. Look at the guy, the fiction of one of these the head of the pool, incredible, and they have the police
open the big door into the shore, probably with very big breaks coming. Probably do that. These doors open as well, but
no.
I think I'll go down in a sec.
And we can just I mean, David, how are you? Congratulations. When are you coming back to us? Are we going to be a rabbi or you're hanging on for another one?
Yeah?
We're going to have a new rabbi too. We're going to come back. It's going to come here in
I'm still available all the time. We haven't been able to reach it. Yeah. That one, I don't want that one.
Well,
Very warm, very generous, very about
Okay, everybody, can you please take your seats? Okay, everybody, come on, please take your seats. Okay, everybody, please take your seats. We want to move on. Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen. Okay. We're now, I think, very privileged to hear from someone that I think many of us have probably heard before, but it's always a pleasure. Dr. Mark Jury is the Anglican Vicar of Caulfield and Elsternwick. He's an academic human rights activist, a Shulman Ginsberg Writing Fellow at the Middle East Forum, an adjunct research fellow at the Arthur Jeffrey Centre for the Study of Islam at Melbourne Institute of Theology. He has published many articles and books on Christian-Muslim relations, Islam and religious freedom. He holds a doctorate in linguistics from the National University and a doctorate on the theology of the Quran from the Australian College of Theology. He has held visiting appointments at the University of Leiden, MIT, UCLA and Stanford, and was elected a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 1992. He's going to continue the theme of the discussion tonight. The title of his talk is Spiritual Roots, the Jews and in the Quran and the Sunnah. Please welcome Dr. Mark Jury.
Thank you, Alan. It's really an honour to be here. It was a bit distressing to hear the flack that we were subjected to in the bookings that had to be cancelled, and also the imputation or the suggestion that we were somehow desiring to spread hate. But I must say, I count it a great honour to be vilified for speaking out against anti-Semitism. Yeah. question I'd like to address with you is Islam anti-Semitic? You've certainly heard some evidence that there are some Muslims who are anti-Semitic in their attitudes, but is that the issue of the religion? Is that really the problem? It's an important question, very important question. Now, I think I'm going to need to just step forward a little bit because I need to see the screen. And the first thing that you need to know is that there are a good number of people, some of them intelligent and influential, who believe that Islam is not anti-Semitic, and they make very clear statements about that. And I'd like to give you some examples of these statements. Nasser David Khalili is an Iranian, now British Jewish billionaire, philanthropist. He collects Islamic art. He was asked on the ABC, I think on The Spirit of Things, whether his work to present Islamic art might help some Muslims realise that Jews are not inferior, to which he quickly responded, I don't think there is a question of the Jews being inferior. I don't think that has ever crossed any Muslim's mind. Virtually 1/3 of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, is in the praise of the two other religions, Judaism and Christianity. I don't think that's even a question at all. The problem is ignorance, and that's the biggest problem in the world today, ignorance, and so on. So that's interesting. He's Sheikh Fahmy, who was a leading sheikh here in Melbourne, he said, writing in the Herald Sun in 2005, Muslims live cheerfully and happily with all denominations. This is what Islam is. The Prophet has lived amongst Jews and Christians in many parts of the world. Muslims, Jews and Christians are living happily. I'm saying, really, there's not a problem with Islam. Bernard Lewis, a more serious contender, really, for an expert on the history of Islam, particularly, he had this interesting thing to say in his book, The Jews of Islam. In Islamic society, hostility to the Jew is not theological. It's not related to any specific Islamic doctrine, nor to any specific circumstance in Islamic sacred history. For Muslims, it's not part of the birth pangs of their religion, as it is for Christians. It's rather the usual attitude of the dominant to the subordinate, of the majority to the minority, without that additional theological and therefore psychological dimension that gives Christian anti-Semitism its unique and special character. So it's basically saying that Christian anti-Semitism is theological, Islamic anti-Semitism is not. Andrei Shuraki, in his book on the Between East and West, History of the Jews in North Africa, there was never any time the Maghreb, that is North African, West North African Muslims, when there was a philosophy and tradition of anti-Semitism such as existed in Europe from the Middle Ages down to modern times. Or Mark Cohen wrote Under Crescent and Cross. Arab anti-Semitism was originally fashioned in the 19th century by Christian Arabs using classical Christian anti-Semitic stereotypes. It's Christians that taught Muslims to be anti-Semitic, according to him. He's a leading expert in the origins of the Quran. Now, there are other views. The World Organization of Jews from Arab Countries produced a report on the persecution of Jews in Arab lands. Arab oppression of Jews is not, therefore, a post-1948 phenomenon. It's rooted in Islam and has been an inescapable characteristic of the relations between Arabs and Jews since Muhammad's time. 20th century Arab persecution of Jews is only a continuation and intensification of this centuries-long tradition in which the socially and religiously inferior Jew bore the brunt of the Muslim masses' contempt and the Muslim government's arbitrary policies and financial troubles. Rambam, I think that's Maimonides. How do you pronounce Maimonides? Correct. He said, on account of our sins, God, he ought to have known something about Islam. On account of our sins, God has cast us into the midst of this people, the nation of Ishmael, who persecute us severely and who devise ways to harm us and to debase us. No nation has ever done more harm to Israel. None has matched it in debasing and humiliating us. None has been able to reduce us as they have. The more we suffer and choose to conciliate them, the more they choose to act belligerently towards us. Ibn Waraq, in The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, is forward to a great book by Andrew Boston. He said this: Muhammad set the example for anti-Semitism. Notice this contrast between what Bernard Lewis says. Bernard Lewis says anti-Semitism is not part of the birth pangs of the religion. But Ibn Warraq says, no, Muhammad set the example. So which is it? The oldest extant biography of Muhammad that Ibn Ishaq has transmitted by Ibn Hisham is replete with the Prophet's evident hatred of Jews. He had individual Jews assassinated if he felt they had somehow insulted or disobeyed him. Muhammad gave the command, kill any Jew that falls into your power. Now this is a commentary. The verse of the Quran says wretchedness and baseness are stamped upon them, about the Jews, Surah 262. And the commentary, it's a medieval commentary from the 14th century by Ibn Kathir. It's very widely used by English-speaking Muslims today because it's a widely available translation. He said this verse indicates that the children of Israel were plagued with humiliation, and this will continue, meaning it will never cease. They will continue to suffer humiliation at the hands of those who interact with them, along with the disgrace that they feel inwardly. Or Al-Maghili said, love of the Prophet requires hatred of the Jews. Or Sirhindi, an Indian Sufi theologian, perhaps he never ever met a Jew, but he said, whenever a Jew is killed, it's for the benefit of Islam. Abdul Rahman al-Sudais is a leading preacher at the Haram Mosque, and the Muslim community in Australia invited him out some years recently to speak. Read history, he said, and you will understand that the Jews of yesterday are the evil fathers of the Jews of today, who are evil offspring, infidels, distorters of others' words, calf worshippers, prophet murderers, prophecy deniers, the scum of the human race, whom Allah has cursed and turned into apes and pigs. These are the Jews, an ongoing continuum of deceit, obstinacy, licentiousness, evil, and corruption. Now, he is one of the lead preachers at the most prestigious mosque in the world, which is the Holy Mosque in Mecca. And also, there's a chapter of the Quran called Al-Fatiha, the opening, and this chapter has the status in Islam, maybe a bit similar to the Shema or to the Lord's Prayer in Christianity. It's recited as part of the daily prayers 17 times a day by every pious Muslim. It's woven into the 5 times rituals. And it's basically a prayer to be rightly guided. But as part of the prayer, it says in Arabic, guide us in the straight path, the path of those thou hast blessed, not of those against whom you are wrathful or who are under the anger of God, nor those who have gone astray. And actually it's Muhammad who said that those who have incurred anger are the Jews, and those who are astray are the Christians. And this is a very, very foundational text. So if you invite an imam to come and pray in a church or in a synagogue or wherever, it's inevitable they will recite this prayer as part of that public worship, because it's a core part of Islam. And a pious Muslim in the course of their life will say this prayer hundreds of thousands of times. Wafa Sultan, the apostate from Islam, she said this is a curse on the Jews, because you're saying basically, if you understand it in the sense that Muhammad said it should be read, you're saying Jews are under the wrath of God. And you can't say that 17 times a day without it having some effect on your heart, you know. Now, there have been a variety of academic discussions. So we have Bernard Lewis. He says that Islam's ill treatment of the Jews wasn't a model of tolerance, but it was a political issue, not a theological issue. Mark Cohen, who I mentioned before, he opposes the myth, both what he calls the myth of Islamic tolerance and the counter-myth of persecution. He regards Jews under Islam as sharing the general situation of dhimmis, these are non-Muslims, and emphasises the protective aspects of the Dhimma Pact. He regards Islam's treatment of Jews with more favour than medieval Christians' treatment of Jews. It's an interesting theme for both Jewish writers. They are, in talking about the treatment of Jews under Islam, they make a comparison and they want to actually say no, Christianity was worse. So they're somehow shaped by their view on Islam is shaped by their feelings about Christianity. There's somehow a link between them for them. Andrew Boston, another Jewish writer, his view explained in The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism is that Muslim anti-Semitism is an original and persistent core feature of Islam, and it's profoundly theological. So I think it's important to note that there's a variety of views, and they're completely incompatible views. They can't all be right. I just want to make a note about Christian anti-Semitism. It has theological bases, replacement theology, antinomianism, opposition to law, negative biblical references to the Jews. There are disputes or contrary positions within Christianity. Augustine was more positive towards the Jews. Chrysostom was appallingly critical. Luther was very anti-Jewish in his theology. Calvin was much more positive towards the Jews, so Calvinistic countries generally have been better for Jews than Lutheran countries. And there's a variety within the Christian tradition. But I'm not here to speak about Christian anti-Semitism, as important that is, as an issue that is. I'm speaking about Islam. So now, if you're going to say, is this anti-Semitism arising from the core of Islam, you need to ask, what is the core? You know, what is the foundation? And the foundation of Islam, the canon of Islam, is the Quran, a text believed to be revealed or dictated to Muhammad. And also what's called the Sunnah, which means the way or the path, the customary way. And this comprises the hadith, these are the traditions of Muhammad's actions and sayings, and the seerah, the biography of Muhammad. So the life of Muhammad, what he did and said, and also what his companions did and said, is a core part of the canon of Islam. Muhammad is considered to be the best example, and basically what he did Muslims should follow. And a great deal of Islamic practice is based on the life and the teaching of Muhammad. So in order to ask, is anti-Semitism in Islam part of the core, you have to ask, was Muhammad hostile to the Jews? Because if he was, then it means that theologically that hostility is rooted in the core of Islam, because he is the core of Islam. Now, Islamic anti-Semitism is grounded in a number of theological points. One is the Quran's anti-Jewish statements, and Al-Fatiha, I've mentioned that already, that part of the daily prayers. Secondly, there's the hostile example of Muhammad's dealings with Jews, including comments in the hadiths. Thirdly, Islamic replacement theology. That's a big topic, but basically Islam teaches that all prophets were Muslims. Islam corrects and perfects previous religions. Islam teaches that it is the authentic Judaism and the authentic Christianity. Teaches that Moses was a Muslim, Solomon was a Muslim. If ever Solomon built a temple, it was a mosque, basically. That's the Islamic view. So that kind of replacement theology itself is hostile theology. There's also a general anti-infidel theology of Islam. There's an anti-disbeliever or anti-non-Muslim theology which Jews get caught up under. Islam must dominate, Muslims are the best people, they have a divine mandate to command right and forbid wrong. And there's the Quran's calls to jihad against the people of the book, including Jews and Christians. There are also specific end times teachings that Jesus, Isa, will impose Islam by the sword, and he'll defeat an antichrist figure. Dajjal sometimes is called a Jewish figure and has Jewish fighters behind him. So Jesus, the true Jewish Messiah, according to Islam, will kill the false Jewish Messiah and his followers in the end times. Now, there are different categories of disbelievers in the Quran, and these are the numbers of times words are used for different categories. So 30 of all these different examples of references to disbelievers, 37% are to disbelievers in general, using the root kufar, kafir. 12% are to associators, the mushrik. 8% are to hypocrites. So the associators are the pagan Arabs. The 8%, the hypocrites, these are Muslims who sort of turned back and rejected Islam. They're not compliant enough. 3% of the references are to Christians, and 23% are to people of the book, which are Jews and Christians, but mostly the focus is on the Jews. And 17% are to the Jews. So if you put the people of the book together and the Jews together, there's actually a lot, there's 40% or so of the Quran, of the comment about non-Muslims about Jews. So the Quran is very interested in Jews. There's a lot to say about Jews, much more than about Christians. If you're a believing Muslim and you've studied the Quran, you know what it says, you'll have a lot of thoughts about Jews because it's part of your religion to have thoughts about Jews. And for that reason, every Jew has a right to understand the Quran for himself. I have the view that if there's a book that says a lot about me, I have a right to know what's in it. And you'd have a right to know and study what's in the Quran, because it has a lot to say about you if you're a Jew. Now, we're going to look at the Quran, and there's a handout, which is a couple of sheets that was at the door. I recently finished a book on the theology of the Quran, and part of that was to look at its descriptors of the different categories. So this is a summary of some of the things the Quran says about the Jews. The question we're asking is anti-Semitism part of the root? Is it part of the Quran? So the Quran says that there are very few Jews that are true believers. Some of them pervert the words from their meaning. They say we hear, but we disobey. Allah has cursed them, so they believe not, except a few. So Allah has cursed the Jews in general, except there are just a few believers. Good Jews, who are the good Jews? Those are the ones who accept Muhammad and his Quran. So there are some good Jews, they're the ones that become Muslims. In the past, it says Jews were changed into pigs and monkeys. There's a few references to that. Jews are repeatedly called prophet killers. You heard some of the speakers say that. They accuse the Jews of prophet killers. This is because it's mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's mentioned a lot of times. The Jews claim they killed the Messiah as Jesus, as Islam understands it. Jews are said to be corrupters and concealers of scriptures. They are by nature liars because of that, and they particularly lie about what's in the scriptures. Allah has renounced his covenant with the Jews. There's no more covenant. Muslims will always find Jews to be treacherous, breaking their promises, so they will be treacherous till the end of time. Jews are losers because they've forsaken their true guidance. It's a very bad thing in Islam to be a loser, I can tell you that. David and Jesus in the Quran both cursed the Jews. An example of a cursing verse is Allah's curse. He's cursed them for their disbelief. Because Allah has cursed them, therefore they don't believe, because they've been cursed by Allah into disbelief. Jews are slanderers and mockers. They're greedy and usurious. They are jealous of Muslims. Only Islam will be accepted from them. Allah doesn't accept any deed or work from anyone. This is Ibn Abbas, an early commentator, unless it conforms to the law of Muhammad. Before, people used to follow their different prophets, but after Muhammad, the only Islam. Islam was the first religion. The Quran says Abraham was a Muslim, not a Jew or a Christian. The religion of Abraham was and is Islam, according to the Quran. That's one of the problems I have with the phrase Abrahamic faiths, because in Islam, the religion of Abraham is Islam. And it's an Islamic term, Abrahamic religion. Jews, it says, are the greatest enemies, violent in hatred towards Islam. Jewish people do not love Muslims, and they will never love a Muslim until he becomes a Jew. Jews start wars and cause corruption or rottenness. The word means being rotten. Any kind of divergence from Islam would be that. Jews say Allah has a son, and they call Uzair, who I think is Ezra perhaps, they call him the son of God. Jews are cursed because they accused Allah of having a weak hand. Jews love the present life and they don't wish for death. They don't care about things of eternity. You'll often see the Palestinian jihadis say, we love death and they love life, so they're going to lose. Given all this material, would you say that hatred of Islam is not part of the birth pangs, hatred of the Jews is not part of the birth pangs of Islam? Would you agree with Mark Cohen or with Bernard Lewis that anti-Semitism is not part of the root of Islam? It's not part of the Quran's worldview? That's a kind of preposterous view. One of the interesting things is that some of the people that make these statements are historians. They're not theologians. But I'll come back at the end to the question of why there's denial. Why really quite intelligent people have a lot of good things to say about many things, can say something so patently false about Islam as that. This is quite a confusing issue, actually. How can someone who's an expert on this topic say something so obviously wrong if you really look at it in a innocent way? Now, what about Muhammad's example? Remember, Islam is grounded on Muhammad. His example is the perfect example. So if it involves Muhammad, it's part of the root of the religion. Earlier in his prophetic career, he said the Jews had their religion and the Muslims had theirs. That's in the Pact of Medina, which was a pact made including Jews of Medina. And there's a verse in the Quran that says, ask the people of the book. So the Muslims, if they're not sure about their religion, they can ask the people of the book. But the story that Islam gives is that Muhammad begins to dialogue with Jews in Medina, particularly rabbis, and he found them very frustrating to deal with. And one of the problems he found with them is they kept asking lots and lots of questions that he didn't like the questions. And they would just wear him out with all their questions. And he'd say, well, you know that I'm the Messiah, or you know that I'm the one that's sent. And they'd say, no, we don't know that because of this and this and this. And he'd get very angry with them. And they used to annoy the apostle with questions, and they introduced confusion as to confound the truth with falsity. What that means is they didn't agree with him. So he initiated a program of assassinating Jews. And at one point, he said to his followers, kill any Jew who comes into your power. He began to assassinate individuals, and there's quite a lot of hadiths that speak about those assassinations. That's a continuous problem, actually. In Malaysia today, there are a number of pastors who've just disappeared. And the most likely thing that's happened is that they have been killed. Same things happen in Nigeria. It's an Islamic issue because it's the example of Muhammad's followers. It's embedded in the birth pangs of the religion, assassination of religious people who don't agree with Islam. Then he begins to expel certain tribes, Jewish tribes. There were several Jewish tribes in Medina. They were quite powerful. I think some historians suggest that if they decided at the start to oppose Muhammad, they could have easily overcome him, but they didn't. And one by one, he began to drive them out. And then the last tribe was the Qurayza, and these are the ones that it wasn't actually Khaybar, it was in Medina, that there was the genocide of the Qurayza, and he beheaded 600 to 800. Then he attacked Khaybar, and the people in Khaybar, the Jews there negotiated a surrender. But Muhammad picked up 2 slave wives. These were women who'd been married to leading Jews in Medina and in Khaybar, and one of them agreed to marry him. She must have been so traumatized, she was taken to him past the burnt and tortured and beheaded body of her husband to spend the night with him in the marriage tent. Muhammad rebuked the Muslim for the insensitivity of taking her past the dead husband, and then he married her. And one refused to marry him, but just became his sex slave. Now, these 2 women are celebrated by Muslims among the wives of Muhammad. I've even heard Muslims say, of course, Islam has a positive view to Jews because some of Muhammad's wives were from Jewish background. It's a bit like saying that the head of the Islamic State is positive towards Americans because he had a sex slave who was an American woman. Now, these events actually became paradigmatic in Islamic theology for Islam's whole theology of war against non-Muslims. So Muhammad's treatment of the Jews, Medina and in Khaybar, became the foundations in Islamic law for the treatment of the Hindus of India and the Christians of the Middle East and the whole world. So, for Bernard Lewis to say that antipathy or hostility towards the Jews is not part of the birth pangs of Islam, it's like, what was he on when he said that? How does someone so intelligent and knowledgeable say something that is so patently ridiculous? I mean, it is. It's shocking, actually. It's interesting, on Rosie, the Balinese bomber, when he was convicted in the courtroom, he had a little moment in the sun, and he cried out a translation in Indonesian of that chant. Remember Khaybar, he said. Jews, the armies of Muhammad are coming back to get you. Why does a Balinese bomber who's been convicted of blowing up Australians or whoever cry out against the Jews when he's convicted? Because hatred of Jews is hardwired into his faith. And because Khaybar, the destruction of the Jews of Khaybar, is paradigmatic within Islam for the treatment of all non-Muslims. Now, there's also this eschatological hadith, and there's more as well, which we looked at before. Allah's apostle said, the hour will not be established until you fight against. And in Arabic, the word fight means to kill. It's very clear. Kill the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew is hiding will say, or the tree, there's a Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him. There's various versions of the tradition. Now, I want to ask a few questions. And these are really important questions to ask, and they're deep questions, and they're actually quite difficult questions. why is Islamic anti-Semitism, the theological nature of it, so persistently denied? Why do people have trouble acknowledging that it's a theological issue? And what are the forces which generate and validate that kind of denial? Because that's actually what you're struggling with. That's why we've had trouble getting this meeting to happen, because there's denial at work. Of course, it's important to understand these things. You know, the situation of Jews in Europe is getting worse and worse. These are not, you know, theoretical discussions. These are discussions that affect people's blood, you know, and their capacity to live, actually, at all. There's a whole history to this. This is a really complex issue. One issue was, there were scholars in the 19th century, some of them Jews, who actually ran a polemic against Christianity, and one of the ways they did that was to promote the myth of an Islamic golden age, which became taken up into the Western consciousness of history. And it's deceptive and it's not true, but it's had a profound influence on many people's thinking. There's also a kind of general Western sense of guilt as well, a self-incrimination, guilt about colonialism, guilt about what we've done to the Muslims. There's Western ignorance and denial of the significance of religion. This is huge. You know, Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses. And when you think about it, what that means is that it's not a cause, it's an instrument. So it's not religion that causes anything. Religion is just used to dominate, to exploit. It's a tool. But the real forces are, you know, money, power, other things. Now, that view that religion is nothing, or it's an instrument of patriarchy, religion is not a cause, it's actually a tool to exploit women by men, for example. Now that idea that religion is not a cause of anything is very deeply embedded in Western academic institutions, in sociology, in psychology, in philosophy, in views of history. It's become part of the way people think. So it's very difficult for Western people to believe that religion could cause anything at all. And part of that is the belief that many people have that all religions are the same. There's just a kind of personal comfort blanket that you take to bed at night, you know. And so the idea that religion could actually determine societies, change societies, shape civilizations, be a driver, and not just an instrument being used for other purposes, this is just completely beyond people's imagination. Very hard to understand. They don't have the categories to think Islam could cause Muslims to act and think in certain ways. That's just impossible to imagine. Islam is just like Muslim is like an ethnicity. It's like eating curry or something. It couldn't change the way you actually act and think in the world. You know, this is very hard for people. I can't emphasize that enough. Another issue is Islamic lack of self-awareness. This is the doctrine of the perfection of the Ummah. I think one of the slides we saw before is that it said that Muslims have very anti-Semitic attitudes, say in Britain, but they don't think they do. They don't see that they have any animosity towards Jews as an issue. It's not an issue for them. And Islam teaches that Muslims are the Ummah, the Islamic community, is perfect. You are the best people, the Quran says, that Allah has raised up. And also Islam believes that when it conquers nations, it's generous. It's generous to let them live. It's generous to allow them to live under Islamic system. They are owed gratitude by their conquered peoples. And this idea of superiority, of being a natural recipient of thankfulness, of being generous, of being superior, is so deeply embedded theologically in Islamic self-consciousness that it's very hard for Muslims to be self-critical. And so you don't find significant movements across the Muslim world of apologising for conquering Egypt or apologising for, you know, the rape of India or whatever. This is not something that Muslim intellectuals and leaders are doing, except very small numbers of people who are marginal and whose existence is threatened. Another issue is personal relationships. This is big for academics. If you spend your whole life visiting libraries, working with scholars in the Middle East, travelling around, it's very hard to distance yourself from Muslims who have these views about their identity by being critical about a core aspect of their religion. And so you actually build a worldview in which you just don't go into certain areas. You don't criticise Islam. You're not critical about its anti-Semitic views. And I think those sorts of issues, and also personal self-interest issues for academics, these shape the mentality and the worldview of some very smart people and very influential scholars, and it corrupts the way they think. I've been an academic. I was head of linguistics at Melbourne Uni. I know academics are not perfect, and they are corruptible too, you know, in subtle ways. For example, if I had at a certain point decided to be openly critical about the government of Indonesia, I would never have got another research permit to do fieldwork there. And I was a linguist, so I didn't have a reason to be critical particularly. I'm not a political scientist. But I was very conscious that there was a kind of unspoken contract that if I wanted to do fieldwork in Indonesia, I had to stay on good terms with the Indonesian government. Multiply that many times for academics working in Islamic studies. Many of the Islamic studies centres in the world are funded by the Middle East. I'm speaking about places like Oxford and Georgetown, so on. So the flow of the money coming from the Middle East as well. There's the denial of the history of the limit. There's the denial of what it was like for non-Muslims living under Islam. There's also the war of words over Palestine and Israel. If you take the view that Israel is the aggressor, Palestinians are the victims, then of course you will not want to talk about Islamic anti-Semitism, because it works politically against your agenda. It undermines your position. And so you deny that. You won't engage with it. There's an English priest, actually, who wrote a book, Cross and Crescent, very influential. And he, early in his career, became very friendly with some Palestinian Christians. He was touched by their story of victimhood, and it became embedded in his whole understanding of Israel. And in recent years, he's been supporting the movement across the UK amongst churches to oppose Israel, to criticise Israel, I would say to demonise Israel. But as part of that, as a symptom of that, he actually denies the role of Islamic theology in the jihad. So he has gone on record, published, saying that it was not until the late 60s that the Muslims of the Middle East thought of their battle against Israel as a jihad. They only came to that really reluctantly and after decades of Israeli aggression. But in fact, we know that back in 1948 there were declarations of jihad against Israel. But what's interesting to me is that his worldview has become so corrupted that he actually buys into easily falsifiable views about history, because he needs to do that in order to sustain his political bias. There's also in the West a residual kind of anti-Semitism. So people don't want to engage with the roots of anti-Semitism of any kind. Another reason is fear. It's safer to blame the Jews. I once met with the Bishop of Jerusalem, who was doing a trip around the world, Anglican bishop, and he would speak to churches and he'd say, look, the Israelis are terrible. I had to go through their checkpoints and they humiliated me, and they're just so cruel, and it's hard what's happening. And I listened to him, and then I said, well, I understand that Palestinians have some issues, the Christians have some issues with Muslims. You know, I've heard of land expropriations, and you've got problems with your girls, and there's threats and, bullying of all kinds. And I said, you don't seem to be talking about that. And he said, what can we do about that? He knew only too well that Christians were suffering at the hands of Muslims amongst the Palestinian community. But it's safe to attack Israel. You know, it's safe to criticise the Jews. And the fear is that if he said the same things about the Palestinian Authority, he'd be finished. And that's a big issue. And that's actually runs so deep in our culture. There's a lot of fear. I think that's one reason why the leaders in New South Wales and elsewhere, they don't engage with Islam, because it's frightening to do so. And it goes very deep. The way this works, if you feel threatened and fear is driving you, you deny that fear drives you, because to acknowledge that fear was driving you would mean to confront your fear. And so you suppress that. You don't want to engage with that. Psychologically, it's not acceptable to acknowledge that fear is driving you. But it does. It does shape you, and it works very deep. Now, this makes all this material that I've been speaking about very problematic and difficult to engage with. You'll get conflicting views by people who seem to be experts, but actually say things that are quite false. I am absolutely clear that Islam's hostility to the Jews is hardwired into the Quran and into the life of Muhammad. It has its own distinctive theological base, It's quite different from the Christian foundations of Christian anti-Semitism, which are real. It's quite distinctive. There's a unique Islamic anti-Semitism. And you will find, if you look from the first centuries through 1400 years, you'll find century after century Islamic leaders echoing these views, expressing them. That's why you see the consistency of similar sentiments and statements across those different Islamic authorities. They say similar things about the Jews. And the similarity between someone preaching in the Middle East or someone preaching in Sydney is because they're singing from the same song sheet. They're being inspired by the same core texts. If you want to follow more about what I've said about Islam and what's happening in the world, markjury.com, there's resources, there's books and so on. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Alan.
Thanks, Mark. I think we've had two fantastic talks. What I'm going to do is bring two chairs to the front so that Mark and David can come and make themselves comfortable. Now you know how they always say at these things, we just like short questions and no speeches. Well, I think I'm going to say that too. It is late, but we do want to have some discussion. There is a roving microphone. I'm not sure that we'll actually need it, so we'll see how we go. So we'll have a bit of a discussion. If you need to leave, then we understand. So you know, there is a bit of favouritism going on here because the first question is going to be to my partner from Nothing Left, Michael Bird. So I'm going to let him ask the first question, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. Go ahead, Michael.
Mike Bird. You don't need it, Michael.
Okay. One of our most senior Jewish community leaders is Sydney-based and is part of a group of Jewish community leaders desperate for this event not to go ahead, made some, in my view, ignorant assertions, and many straight out of the Dimitude manual, also insinuating the Islamic threat to Jews is exaggerated by us. I would like Reverend Jury to comment on just one of his assertions in particular, which I've actually heard before from a Melbourne rabbi, and that is, it is disingenuous for you as a non-Muslim to interpret the Islamic text.
Yeah, look, there's a view in Islam that non-Muslims shouldn't study Islamic texts, and they shouldn't study it for themselves, and they should really just ask a Muslim, right? And they should submit whatever they say. Oh, that's what you believe, okay. But being a Protestant, I'm of the view that you sort of should read for yourself and come to your own views, you know. And I think that when there's so much hostility towards you in a text, you have a right to come to your own views about it, and not just to be subject to someone else's whitewashing, really. And look, if you're a Muslim, and suppose you are a really kind-hearted Muslim, and you love Jews, and you love Christians, and you want to get on, and someone comes to you and says, look, is it true that the Quran says this and this and this? You're in a very difficult place. It's kind of shameful to acknowledge that's the truth. And I wouldn't rely on that sort of person to give you an honest answer, unless they were really an exceptional person. So I think you have the right to study the text for yourself. And it's very dangerous to say you don't have the right to do that. That's Islamic thinking. You know, only Muslims can pass judgment on what's in the Quran. In fact, it's forbidden under Islamic law for non-Muslims to express any negative opinion about the Quran. And there's a reason for that. You know, there's a reason why that's forbidden. I don't accept that reason. I think that's completely intolerable, and any book that says so much about me, I have a right to have my own views about it.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Just before I do go to the next question, I want to point out that David is filming this, and of course, where his position is that some people might be on camera. If you do have a problem with it, please say so, because that can be pixeled out. Yeah. Question down the back there.
Question for Reverend Duran. We hear about people call for reform in Islam as a solution. I'd like to know your view on that. And also the concept of radicalisation. Do you think that's a real thing, or is that cast them as victims incorrectly?
I think the Royal Institute, Al-Al-Bayt Institute in Jordan, which is set up by the Jordanian royal family, puts out surveys of Muslims in the world from time to time. And their estimate was that about 1% of Muslims in the world have a moderate outlook. And this is basically, this is their own estimate, and their emphasis is that this has absolutely nothing to do with the mainstream of Islam and Islamic thought. So look, there are Muslim moderates, and there are Muslims who have a different take of Islam, but they're very marginal. My personal view as a theologian who believes in the power of the text is that I can't see a way of remaining kind of fundamentally faithful to the Quran and the Hadith and the life of Muhammad, and to produce what we would call a reformed understanding of Islam. The Quran and the Hadith, they just don't leave those openings, you know. I sometimes compare it, it's like playing cards, and you know, someone has a 6 in their hand, and the other person has Ace, King, Queen, Jack, 10, 9, 8, 7. Now the person with all the high cards is the radical, as we call him, and the moderate has a 6. He says, I've got a 6. He says, no, I've got an ace, you know. And the problem is, if you can find one verse in the Quran that supports peace, I can find 10 that don't. And so it's actually, to put this another way, if you bring an impressionable 15-year-old and you put a well-trained radical in the room with a moderate, the radical will win if the conclusion has to be based on the authority of Muhammad and the Quran. If that's the reference point, then it's very hard to so-called reform Islam. Another thing to say about that is the medieval idea of reform was to go back to foundations. And that's already happened. And that's what Al-Qaeda is. Yeah, that sort of reform, that's already happening all around the world. But the reform that's just a moderation of introducing secular views, that's actually been tried and not been very successful. Did you want to say something, David?
Sorry, also sort of the concept of radicalisation.
Yeah, well, I actually quite like the idea of radical Islam, because radical means root. And so I think it means going back to the root. As a process, I think it's a bit mumbo-jumbo sometimes. Like, one of the problems is that the fundamentals of Islam are radicalising. You know, if you agree that Muhammad's the best example, if you agree that the Quran is the word of God, then it's not that complicated to take the person to what he actually said and what the Quran said, and then lead to the conclusions that trigger someone into violence. So I don't see it as a separate process from actually forming someone in Islam. It's an integral part of a formation process.
Just behind you, we'll go over to
Reverend, what you say is correct. For what I understood, 1% of the Muslim world is reformed, and the 99% is not, and it's not going to be reformable unless they abandon their religion. Now, there's over 1 billion Muslims in the world, so where are we going?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, sometimes people reject this perspective that Islam's not really reformable because they can't see a solution. So it becomes an unacceptable thing to say because you can't see how the world can have peace that way. I don't think that's a very healthy way of thinking. Actually, people are stepping away from Islam. And many of the refugees that have been flooding into Germany actually rejecting Islam. Churches in Germany are full of ex-Muslims. I lead a church of 130 ex-Muslims in Dandenong. They're all Iranians. They actually came to Australia disliking Islam. One young Muslim I met, every Friday he had to go and curse the Jews as part of a big public event. And while he was doing this, he said, who are these people that we're supposed to be cursing? I don't like the government. These must be really good people. And he began to really love the Jews. And so actually I do see signs of hope and change. And wherever there's been very radical expressions of Islam, like in Iran, the people have turned away. And so, well, yeah, I think we're in for a very tumultuous time. The government just cannot control the rejection of Islam in Iran. It's exploding. We see similar signs amongst Arabs, amongst some of the refugees. It doesn't mean everything's going to be sweetness and light, but there's something quite, unstable about Islam. And the thing that's made it unstable is actually access to information, awareness of the facts about the life of Muhammad. In the past, ordinary Muslims didn't study these sources for themselves. They just went to the local imam and they believed what the imam said. But now Muslims can read what Muhammad said and did, and they can make their own moral decisions about it. And that's very disturbing for many of them. And so I do see hope, but it's a hope in the midst of, you might say, disaster and trauma. So you have both things happening, war and also transformation happening at the same time. I know my Christian friends who are doing missions work in Lebanon and in Jordan, they're just overwhelmed with the numbers of Muslims wanting to leave Islam. And their logic runs like this: we've been told ISIS is true Islam. If that's true, I can't follow Islam. So, you know, that sort of thinking is increasing more and more across the Middle East. More than 1 million Iranians have left Islam and become Christians in the last 30 years. So yeah, so there's some light there, but hard times ahead, really.
Good evening, Michael. Thank you very much. Your presentations have been very informative. I just wanted to point out there's a book by a fellow called J. H. Feynman called People versus Mohammed. I would strongly recommend that everybody go online and get a copy of that. And could you explain to us the concept of taqiyya in Islam, please?
Taqiyya, there's a reference to this in the Quran. It's a doctrine that says that, well, the basic principle is that Muslims should not be friends with non-Muslims, but they're allowed to be friends with non-Muslims if they need to have them as their protectors, their guardians, if you like. So that means that if Muslims are in a minority position and they're dependent on non-Muslims for their safety, they're allowed to be friends with non-Muslims for that purpose. The commentators have interpreted this in these kinds of terms. One commentator said, we smile to their faces, but our hearts are comforted by hatred. And another commentator says this taqiyya, this deception, this covering, as it means, will continue till the resurrection, till the end. So this is the idea that when Muslims are minority position and vulnerable, they're allowed to lie in the sense of pretending friendship in order to keep themselves safe, while maintaining, being comforted in their faith, by hatred in their hearts. Now, it's an incredibly disturbing doctrine, and I don't think all Muslims follow it, but it's very well laid out in Islamic commentaries and teachings. And I must admit, I mean, I find it very distressing to read about these things, and it does, without a doubt, influence some Muslims in the way they deal with non-Muslims.
Okay, thank you. Henry.
I have a question for the doctor, please, because I think you haven't spoken yet. I don't think this is on yet. Oh, just give it a flick. I don't know about these things. I've got no idea about microphones. Hello, can anyone hear me? Okay. In the light of the plebiscite we are experiencing at the moment, I'm just interested to know, because it's never brought up, I see pictures of people being thrown off buildings for being homosexual. Just in the light of the threat of Islam and their attitudes and what we've been talking about tonight, would there be an Australian Muslim who would vote yes in the plebiscite? I know it's a difficult question.
I mean, I think you should ask a Muslim spokesman that question.
No, but
I've read the reports of penalties that are applied for homosexuality in Islam, and there's a very colourful compilation of Islamic expert opinions that was put into a document by the Middle East Media Research Institute, Memory. They don't just do TV, they do other work as well. And the debate talks about whether you throw off buildings, whether you roll them down mountains. There are all sorts of colourful ways of dealing with homosexuals, stoning, etc. And it's not required to be triggered by marriage. We have many examples of homosexuals being hung in Iran. Some of them, you know, horrible pictures you see of people dangling from cranes, etc. I've heard a very odd conspiracy theory in Australia. Now, I don't give it credence, but I'll just mention it for information. Why has the Islamic representatives in Australia been so quiet in the same-sex marriage debate? And the conspiracy theory is this: if it goes through, it opens the door to the next step, which is polygamy.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take this one.
We wait for the microphone.
This question is directed to both. We've heard a lot of doom and gloom here, and we understand that there is a huge problem. So the question is, where do we go from here?
Perhaps we should come back one day and do a session on solutions, because it's a huge subject in its own right. Unfortunately, most of our political leaders are not willing to even acknowledge the problem, much less tackle it. So I'll mention one strategy, just one, of which there are many. I showed you examples of Islamic hate preaching and anti-Semitism. How much of this is being conducted in Australian mosques, in Australian madrasas, which are Islamic schools, in Islamic centres of various types? And the answer is, we have no idea. There was an interesting exercise that the BBC did, where a couple of undercover reporters went into mosques with hidden cameras and microphones to record what was happening. If you simply put into YouTube BBC undercover mosques, you'll get some of the videos which were recorded, and it's quite shocking stuff. There was a study done in the US, a survey of 100 mosques, where they sent Arabic and Urdu speaking people in to listen to the sermons, to have a look at the literature, to have a look at the videos that were in the mosques, and then classified them according to levels of violence: high level, medium level, low level, with over 50% in the top two levels, well over 50%. And we have no idea in Australia. So one strategy that we need to employ is to understand and quantify the problem better by monitoring. If you don't know, maybe that's my medical background, if you can't make a diagnosis, you can't treat the problem. We don't have a diagnosis in Australia yet, we haven't quantified it. But that would be one strategy I'd advocate.
It's a very simple comment. Denial is very dangerous. And just being able to talk about things openly is very important, and to understand the problems. One of the problems with our very pragmatic, solution-oriented worldview is that we don't want to be told about a serious problem unless there's a solution. It's almost like, tell me the solution first, you know. But actually this is a big problem and we need to live with it for a while. And the solutions will come, but they're complex and they need to be worked through in every situation. I mean, part of it is Australia being very clear about saying no to Sharia in lots of different ways. And it's sending a clear message that people need to live according to the laws of the land. We already have a de facto tolerance of polygamy very extensively throughout the Muslim community. It's even built into Centrelink's rules, and you know, we have showed absolutely no will to seriously penalise clerics who conduct polygamous marriages. And so one of the reasons we don't have that will is we don't have a discussion about the implications. You know, where does that track lead? I think we should be more willing to take on the issues. Why didn't Jewish leaders make a complaint using the laws available against some of these anti-Jewish hate preachers? Why is there this unwillingness to engage with that process and to bring it more into the light? So that's important. I don't think it's in the interest of the safety of the Jewish community to suppress this discussion. I think it's a very dangerous and self-destructive kind of bent to not allow the conversation to happen. And I applaud the leaders of the community here in the synagogue who have been willing to host this discussion. This is the sort of thing that needs to happen. Solutions will come if we are willing to acknowledge the truth.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is getting late, so I think we'll formally close the evening tonight. One more time, please thank our two speakers for their fantastic presentation.
as Mark said, thanks again to South Caulfield Shul. You've been fantastic, and we really appreciate it. Please join AJA. There's little slips of paper with our website. Now, just one more thing before I finish. We do need to stack up the chairs. So I was going to ask if some of the guys could help out, but that's probably politically incorrect. So I'm just going to say, if anybody can help stack the chairs, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for coming, and we do look forward to being in, having